Rick and Morty has built one of the most divided fandoms in animated television. Fans can tell you exactly who they love and who they cannot stand. The interesting part is not who ended up on which list, it is what those choices reveal. In this video, we break down the most hated versus most loved Rick and Morty characters. Section 1. The Divided Kingdom. Rick and Morty arrived in 2013 as a riff on the Back to the Future dynamic. A genius scientist and his less capable companion reset inside a dysfunctional family and pointed at the entire sci-fi genre. What it became, fairly quickly, was something harder to categorize. The show's writers built a world that refused to follow the usual promises animated comedies make to their audience. Consequences accumulated. Characters changed under pressure. The show held two contradictory things in its hand at the same time, the joke and the wound underneath it, and refused to drop either one. That double nature, funny and genuinely painful in the same breath, turned out to be exactly the environment in which strong character feelings grow. When a show commits to that depth, audiences do not have the comfortable distance that pure comedy provides. They start to feel things, and feeling things about fictional people tends to produce opinions. The opinions produced by this show have a particular quality. Discussions about Rick and Morty characters do not usually stay at the level of preference. They go somewhere closer to judgment. Fans who love Morty do not just find him entertaining. They cite his arc, his trauma, his growth, the way the show has treated him across years of storytelling as evidence of something the character deserves. Fans who love Evil Morty treat his appearances as events, something closer to the arrival of a philosophical argument than the return of a recurring character. And fans who despise Jerry Smith, who has reliably drawn the most sustained negative reaction of any main character in the show's history, tend to describe their feelings in terms that go well past disliking his storylines. Something about Jerry makes people genuinely irritated in a way that a one-note comic character usually does not. And that intensity of response is itself the first clue that something more interesting is happening underneath the surface reaction. The show earned that depth of engagement through a very specific writing philosophy. Dan Harmon and his team built the Smith household as a place where every character is simultaneously sympathetic and culpable. Nobody in the family is simply good. Nobody is simply the problem. Rick is brilliant and cruel and deeply wounded, and also, undeniably, the gravitational center of his own small universe. A man who makes every situation worse in ways that are sometimes intentional and sometimes just who he is. Morty is kind and also capable of genuine selfishness, growing darker by the season as the adventures he has been pulled into take their toll. Beth is smart and competent, and also, as the series eventually makes plain, more similar to her father than she ever wanted to admit, including the parts of him that are genuinely frightening. Summer is sharp and quick, and also gets drawn steadily toward the orbit of a grandfather whose habits are anything but good for her. And Jerry is ordinary, in a show and a family where being ordinary is the one thing nobody respects. What that setup produces is a cast of characters who invite the audience to make a judgment. Not in the didactic way, where a story tells the viewer what the right verdict is. In the more unnerving way, where the story lays everyone out in full view and waits to see what each person notices. A viewer who relates to Rick's intellectual frustration will read his cruelty toward Jerry differently than a viewer who sees the domestic damage that cruelty causes. A viewer who finds Jerry's mediocrity relatable will have a completely different response to his storylines than a viewer who experiences his lack of self-awareness as embarrassing. The show does not adjudicate between these readings. It holds them both open, and the audience splits along the fault lines of its own self-perception. That split is worth sitting with for a moment because it explains something about the intensity of the disagreements. When fans argue about Rick and Morty characters, they are often, without realizing it, arguing about themselves. The person who loves Rick and cannot stand Jerry is frequently someone who identifies with intelligence as a core value and experiences ordinary competence as a kind of failure. The person who defends Jerry and finds Rick exhausting is often someone who has lived inside the dynamic that Rick represents, surrounded by people who treat cleverness as a license to be unkind, and has learned to find that dynamic draining rather than thrilling. Neither reading of the show is wrong. Both are responses to real things the writing put there on purpose. The fan reactions are not noise around the edges of what the show is doing. They are, in many cases, exactly the reaction the show was designed to produce. The characters who draw the most love also tend to be the ones who offer the audience something it does not have to work to earn. Mr. Meeseeks, who became a fan icon before the first season was done, gives the viewer the experience of a creature whose whole existence is organized around one simple principle. He wants to help. The fact that his cheerful helpfulness tips into existential horror when Jerry turns out to be impossible to assist is funny precisely because the Meeseeks' purity of purpose is so appealing. There is something restful about a being who knows exactly what it is for. The audience falls for that the same way it falls for a well-designed tool. Bird Person, who draws consistent affection across the entire run of the show, despite getting relatively limited screen time in the early seasons, works through a different kind of simplicity. He is loyal. He is calm. He delivers his deadpan observations about Rick's behavior with the patience of someone who has known the man for decades and has made a considered choice to keep knowing him anyway. The friendship between Rick and Bird Person is one of the few relationships in the show that the writing treats as genuinely sacred, and the audience registers that treatment and responds in kind. Evil Morty is the most interesting case in the love column because the character earns his massive fandom not through warmth or humor, but through something closer to an intellectual thrill. He is introduced in the first season as a mystery, a Morty who controls a Rick instead of the other way around, which immediately inverts the show's most basic premise. He then disappears for 2 seasons, while the fan community generated an enormous body of theory and speculation around what he was, what he wanted, and whether the main Morty was somehow connected to him. When he returned as the winning candidate in the Citadel election, and then again as the architect of the Central Finite Curve's destruction, the payoff to that long wait landed with the satisfaction of a plan that had been running longer than anyone realized. Fans love Evil Morty because he represents the most extreme version of the show's own intelligence. He has been doing something no one else noticed, for longer than anyone tracked, toward a goal that turned out to be more philosophically coherent than anyone expected. In a show built around the idea that the universe is indifferent and meaning is something you have to make rather than find, Evil Morty made his own meaning with a patience that even Rick could not match. The characters who draw the most hate follow an equally consistent logic. The audience for Rick and Morty tends to be, by the show's own gravity, people who value cleverness. The show rewards attention, rewards theory, rewards the willingness to follow a long arc across seasons of storytelling and find the connections. The community that built up around it is one where intelligence is a primary currency. Within that community, a character who is not clever, who fumbles, who is governed by insecurity and an almost total lack of self-awareness, is going to read very differently than he might in a different show. Jerry Smith would not be the most resented character on a show with a different kind of audience. He would be a recognizable comic type, the hapless everyman, and the audience would laugh with him as often as at him. In Rick and Morty's particular ecosystem, he became the character that a significant portion of the fandom elected to find unbearable. The more complicated characters, the ones whose reception splits the community rather than unifying it, tend to be the ones closest to the show's actual themes. Beth divides fans because the show itself seems to divide its attention between presenting her as a victim of her father's abandonment and presenting her as someone who has made choices that damaged her own children in turn. Summer has defenders who see her growth across the seasons as one of the most honest arcs in the show, and critics who find her adoption of Rick's worst habits frustrating to watch. Morty himself, beloved in the early seasons when his decency provides the emotional counterweight to Rick's nihilism, has drawn increasing criticism in later seasons as the trauma and the adventures have left visible marks on who he is and how he treats people. The characters who change tend to produce more divided reactions than the characters who stay consistent, because change means the audience has to keep updating its judgment, and not everyone updates in the same direction. What connects all of it, the love and the hate and the passionate debates in between, is that Rick and Morty built something rare. It built a cast of characters specific enough to be recognized, consistent enough to be tracked, and complicated enough to be argued about. A show that wants its audience to feel nothing about its characters will sand off every edge and make everyone pleasant. A show that wants its audience to feel something will leave the edges intact and trust that feeling something, even something uncomfortable like genuine irritation or genuine grief, is better than feeling nothing at all. Rick and Morty made that choice early and has stuck with it through every season. And the result is a fandom that can generate thousands of words of passionate analysis about a cartoon dad who cannot stop embarrassing himself at dinner. The other thing the show did, which almost no other animated series has managed at the same scale, is tie the characters' fates together across time. Because the series commits to continuity, because what happens in Season 1 still matters in Season 8, the audience's feelings about any given character are not frozen at the moment of introduction. They accumulate. A viewer who found Morty charming in the pilot, and then watched him bury his own corpse in the backyard, then watched him grow colder, then watched him spiral inside a death crystal, then watched him make choices that a Season 1 version of himself would not have recognized, does not feel the same thing in Season 8 that they felt in Season 1. The emotional history is layered, and the layers produce complexity. Some fans love the complexity. Some miss the simpler version of the character they first met. Both reactions are honest responses to real things the show has done. This is what makes the love and hate worth examining at length. The audience's responses to these characters are not arbitrary. They are produced by very specific writing choices, very specific thematic commitments, and a very specific relationship the show has built with a very specific kind of viewer. The map of who gets loved and who gets despised turns out to be a map of the show's own values, reflected back through the audience's self-perception. The characters people adore tend to be the ones who confirm something the audience wants to believe about intelligence or loyalty or the possibility of genuine connection in a cold universe. The characters people resent tend to be the ones who show them something about ordinary human limitation that they find painful rather than funny to recognize. Every character examined in what follows earned its position on the list through that mechanism. The most beloved were built to give the audience something it wanted. The most hated were built to show the audience something it did not. The most divisive were built to do both at once, and the divisions they produced are as revealing as the consensus ones. What the fandom chose to love and what it chose to reject across a decade of watching is, in the end, a kind of collective self-portrait. And it is a more honest one than most portraits tend to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next, the focus turns to the character at the center of it all, the one who is both the most beloved and the most complicated, and what made the fandom fall for a man this difficult to admire. Section 2. Rick Sanchez, the one everyone chose. Rick Sanchez tops nearly every fan ranking the show has ever generated. Across voting sites, forum threads, and community polls spanning a decade, the same name lands at the top with a consistency that other characters cannot touch. That is a remarkable result for a character who, on paper, should be one of the harder sells in animated television. He is an alcoholic, he is cruel to the people who love him. He manipulates his grandson as a matter of habit, uses his daughter's emotional need for his approval as a leash, and has caused suffering on a scale that ranges from the personal and domestic to the genuinely planetary. He is not a hero by any traditional measure, and the show is scrupulous about making sure the audience never fully forgets that. And yet, the fandom chose him, decisively and early, and has kept choosing him across every season since. The first thing the show does to earn that choice is establish Rick's intelligence as something the audience can feel rather than just observe. Most fictional geniuses are told to the viewer rather than shown. The writing announces that a character is brilliant and then has other characters react to the brilliance with awe. Rick works differently. The show puts the audience inside his perspective often enough that watching him solve a problem feels like watching a mind that actually works at a different speed from the people around him. The pilot alone moves through dark matter production, a freeze ray, a portal gun, and the casual aside that he once considered building a bomb large enough to end the planet as an afternoon project. All of it delivered with the flat affect of a man doing things he has done so many times they stopped being impressive to him years ago. The shrug is the key. A genius who is amazed by his own genius is tiresome. A genius who has moved so far past being amazed that he is bored is something else entirely. And the audience responds to that boredom as a kind of proof. The second thing the show does is make Rick funny in a way that does not depend on the audience feeling superior to him. A lot of comedy about difficult men works by letting the audience laugh down at the character, enjoying his failures from a safe distance. Rick's humor almost never works that way. His jokes land because he is faster than everyone around him, including the audience. And the laugh comes from catching up rather than from watching someone stumble. His insults land because they are accurate. His observations about the universe are frequently bleaker than anything a comedy should be permitted to say out loud. And they land anyway because the nihilism is earned by someone who has actually seen enough of the universe to have an informed opinion about it. Laughing at Rick requires matching his pace, at least for the length of a punchline. And that experience of keeping up with him creates a sense of complicity that is deeply flattering to the viewer. The third thing, and the one that keeps the love going through seasons of genuinely hard material, is the grief underneath everything. The show is careful to reveal this slowly. Early seasons give glimpses, a look that lasts half a second too long, a line that lands differently once a later episode recontextualizes it, a moment at the end of the Unity episode in the second season that the show stages with quiet restraint and refuses to explain or soften. By the time the full backstory arrives, spread across the 5th and 6th seasons, the audience has been accumulating evidence for years that something catastrophic sits at the center of this man. And the confirmation of what that something is lands with the weight of a thing the viewer already half knew. Diane's loss, the Omega device, the decades of a life organized around a revenge that would never actually fix what it was aimed at. The hologram wife in the frozen dimension. All of it comes into focus as the portrait of someone who was in genuine anguish the entire time the audience was laughing at him. That combination, comedy on the surface and real pain underneath, is the deepest source of the fandom's attachment. The audience senses the grief before the show names it, and sensing something unspoken in a character creates a feeling of intimacy that straightforward storytelling rarely manages. Fans feel like they understand Rick in a way they cannot entirely articulate, because what they have been responding to is not just the jokes or the spectacle, but the signal underneath both of those things. The frequency of a person who is holding something together by sheer force of brilliance, while the thing underneath slowly gives way. The love also survives, and this is the more interesting part. Genuine awareness of how badly Rick treats the people around him. The fandom is not naive about his cruelty. The show does not let it be. Morty's suffering is staged with enough honesty that no viewer can fully miss what it costs a child to be that man's companion. Beth's paralysis, her lifelong uncertainty about whether she is brilliant or merely told she is traceable directly to a father who kept that uncertainty alive because her need for his validation was useful to him. The manipulation is documented, case by case, across hundreds of episodes. Fans see it. They discuss it in detail. They still come back to Rick. What that tells you is something specific about the nature of the attachment. The fandom does not love Rick because it has failed to notice his faults. It loves him the way people love complicated figures in their own lives, with full knowledge of what those figures cost the people around them, and a separate, parallel track of feeling that operates alongside that knowledge without resolving it. This is not a common experience in animated television, where characters tend to be designed to produce simpler, cleaner responses. Rick produces something murkier, the kind of feeling people usually only have about real people they actually know. And the murkiness is what makes the attachment stick. A character who produces only admiration is easy to move on from. A character who produces admiration and discomfort and recognition and grief in the same sitting is much harder to leave alone. The fandom's relationship with Rick also changes across the seasons, in ways that track the show's own shifting portrait of him. Early season Rick is a spectacle. He is the genius who can do anything. And the audience's primary experience of him is delight at what he pulls off and how completely he does it. The escape from the Federation prison in the third season premiere is the peak of this version of Rick, a sequence that demonstrates every tier of his intelligence in one extended display and arrives at a conclusion so total that the show pauses to let the audience sit inside the giddiness of watching someone be that good at what they do. That episode is what a significant portion of the fandom wants Rick to be all the time, and it understands why. What the show then does, slowly and over years, is complicate that delight without canceling it. It keeps giving the audience what it came for, the spectacle, the escapes, the invention, while simultaneously layering in the cost, the loneliness, the near miss in the garage, the frozen dimension, the hologram Diane, the emptiness that follows Rick Prime's death. By the later seasons, the audience is watching the same man it fell for in season 1, but through a different set of eyes, ones that have accumulated years of evidence about what the spectacle has been covering. The love does not disappear. The audience's relationship with Rick at the end of 8 seasons is simply more complicated than it was at the beginning. And that evolution is one of the things that keeps the fandom engaged rather than satisfied. One of the more revealing aspects of Rick's fan reception is what the fandom does with his worst moments. A character like Rick, operating in a lesser show, would be softened whenever the cruelty risks becoming too much. The audience would be given outs, reassurances that the difficult behavior comes from somewhere it can be forgiven, that the character is working on it, that the bad acts are the exception rather than the expression of something deep. Rick and Morty does not consistently offer those outs. The Microverse episode, in which Rick's power source turns out to be an entire civilization of intelligent beings who believe their labor serves their own society and are entirely unaware that they are generating electricity for a drunk man's car, is not followed by a moment of reckoning or guilt. The decoy families, the copies of his own loved ones he seeds around his life so that enemies will kill the duplicates instead of the real people, are played for dark comedy before the moral weight of them is allowed to settle. The show gives the audience Rick's worst moments and then continues, as if to say that this is part of who the man is rather than an aberration from it. The fandom absorbs these moments and keeps the love intact, and the mechanism by which it does so is interesting. Fans do not, for the most part, argue that these things did not happen or did not matter. They argue, with considerable force, that the character's full portrait makes these things comprehensible in a way that changes how they feel without removing the feeling that something was wrong. The microverse exploitation is the work of a man who has seen enough of existence to lose the ability to feel the scale of it the way a person with a narrower view would. The decoy families are the work of a man so terrified of loss that he has industrialized precaution against it. Neither of these explanations exonerates Rick. They simply give the audience a way to hold the behavior alongside the grief and the brilliance and the love that occasionally surfaces in unguarded moments, and to experience all of it as one coherent person rather than a collection of contradictions that cancel each other out. That coherence is ultimately the foundation the fandom stands on. Rick Sanchez works as a character because he is not, despite the complexity, incoherent. His cruelty and his grief and his genius and his isolation are all expressions of the same thing. A mind that encountered an unbearable loss and responded by building every defense available to it and then spending decades trapped inside those defenses. Once the audience understands the shape of that, everything else about him becomes legible. The drinking, the manipulation, the invention, the survival, the long revenge that organized a life so thoroughly that finishing it left nothing standing, all of it fits. And a character who is deeply difficult and completely coherent is one of the rarest things a show can produce. The show also does something important for the fandom's relationship with Rick by giving him a handful of moments where the defenses drop. Not for long, not cleanly, but enough to make the rest of the portrait feel true. He surrenders to an empire at a wedding rather than risk his family. He walks into a ruined friend's mind and stays there until he can pull him back. He accepts a hug in the hollow minutes after achieving the goal that organized his whole life, because there is nothing else left to do. These moments do not happen often, and they do not produce lasting change, but they confirm something the fandom has been intuiting across years of watching. The capacity for connection is there. It has always been there. The man who cannot stop building walls is the same man who, in the moments the walls slip, is entirely worth the effort of caring about. The fandom chose Rick because the show gave it a figure who is brilliant and broken in equal measure, and who makes both of those things feel real. He is aspirational in the ways that the audience wants to be aspirational, sharp and capable and impossible to contain, and honest in the ways that most aspirational figures are not, which is to say that the show never lets the aspiration float free of the cost. He is funny, and he is sad, and he is cruel, and he is capable of genuine tenderness, and he is the loneliest person in any room he walks into. He is, in the specific combination of those things, someone the audience recognizes from real life rather than from other fictions, and that recognition is what makes the love hold. The show built something unusual when it built Rick Sanchez. Not a hero, not a villain, not a cautionary tale, not a genius fantasy. A person, built at a scale that lets the audience examine the seams without losing sight of the whole, complicated in ways that reward attention rather than punishing it, difficult in ways that feel earned rather than arbitrary. The fandom put him at the top of every list because no other character on the show offers what he offers, which is the experience of caring about someone this hard to admire and finding that the effort over years of watching turns out to have been worth it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The focus turns to the other half of the show's title, the character who stood beside Rick from the beginning and built his own devoted following by being almost everything his grandfather is not. Section 3. Morty Smith, the heart the fandom grew with. Morty Smith is not the flashiest character in the show. He does not have Rick's genius or evil Morty's cold calculation or Bird Person's quiet gravity. What he has is something rarer in a series built around cosmic spectacle, which is an emotional core the audience can actually locate from episode to episode. He is the character who feels things in proportion to how bad those things are, who has not yet built the walls Rick has built or adopted the detachment the show uses to make the multiverse survivable. And in the early seasons, that openness makes him the easiest entry point into a show that can otherwise feel deliberately hostile to feeling. The fandom fell for Morty first because he was the character doing the falling, pulling the audience through a world too large and too indifferent to navigate, without someone who was visibly overwhelmed by it. The attachment started in the pilot and was cemented by the end of the first season through a specific quality the writing gave Morty that almost no other character shares with the same consistency. He responds to things honestly. When something is frightening, he is frightened. When something is wrong, he says so. When Rick's behavior crosses a line, Morty is the one who names the line, even knowing that naming it will probably not change anything. That honesty reads as courage in a show full of characters who have learned to protect themselves by feeling less. And the audience registers it as such even when the show is staging it as comedy. A 14-year-old telling the smartest man in the universe that what he just did was not acceptable is inherently funny in terms of the power differential, and the writing plays it that way. But the substance of what Morty is doing is not played for laughs. He is right, consistently. And the show never lets that fact disappear entirely, even when it is too busy with the next crisis to dwell on it. The character was conceived from the beginning as a structural device as much as a person. Rick needs a companion who gives off a specific kind of neural interference, a detail the show reveals in the first season episode, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, where it becomes clear that a Rick traveling with a Morty is significantly harder for enemies to track. Stripped of sentiment, Morty is camouflage. He was chosen, on Rick's side of the equation, not because Rick wanted a grandson, but because Rick needed cover. And the child who volunteered for adventure without knowing the full terms is the most honest image the show has for what it means to love someone who is using you. That foundation does not make the relationship fake. It makes it complicated in exactly the way the show's best relationships are complicated, with real feeling running alongside real exploitation and neither canceling the other out. What the fandom fell for, in the specific way fans fall for a character rather than simply enjoying them, was Morty's refusal to stop being Morty despite everything the show puts him through. The arc across 8 seasons is, on one reading, a story about what it costs a person to be that close to Rick Sanchez for that long. Morty buries his own corpse in the backyard before the first season is out. He watches his original reality end, crawls into the life of a version of himself who just died in a lab accident, and then lives in that borrowed reality indefinitely while the people around him are technically not the family he started with. He goes through the death crystal spiral in the 4th season, steering his own future toward a single imagined death with the focus of someone who has decided that predictability, even the predictability of a bad ending, is preferable to the chaos he has been living. These are not the experiences of a character the writers are protecting. They are the experiences of a character the writers are taking seriously. And the fandom responds to that seriousness with a loyalty that has outlasted considerable discomfort. The discomfort is real, and it has accumulated. From around the 3rd season onward, Morty begins to change in ways that divide the people watching him. The decency that made him the emotional anchor of the early seasons is still present, but it is no longer automatic. It costs him more to access it. He makes choices that a Season 1 version of himself would not have recognized, and the show stages those choices honestly rather than walking them back between episodes. Fans who loved the early Morty as a counterweight to Rick's nihilism find the later Morty harder to hold on to. The character who was once the proof that someone could stay kind in Rick's orbit is becoming evidence for a different argument. The argument that nobody stays unchanged inside that orbit. That Rick's gravity bends everyone who enters it in the direction of the man himself. That evolution has produced genuinely divided responses. Some fans regard Morty's hardening as one of the most honest things the show has done, a refusal to keep a character in amber when the story demands he change. Others feel a real loss around it, missing the specific quality the early seasons had when Morty's goodness was something the show presented as reliable. Both reactions are understandable, and both are responses to real things the writing has done. The show made a choice to let Morty grow into something more complicated, and the cost of that choice is that the character is no longer the simple emotional touchstone he once was. What remains is something with more depth and considerably more pain. A person who started with more feeling than almost anyone else in the cast and has spent years being slowly educated by the universe in the cost of that. The relationship with Rick is where the fandom spends most of its attention when it talks about Morty, and for good reason. Every major development in Morty's character runs through what Rick has done to him, with him, or for him, and the three categories often overlap in ways that are difficult to separate cleanly. The adventures shape him, the manipulation shapes him, the moments of genuine care, which the show is careful to include without making them feel like a redemption arc for Rick, shape him too. By the later seasons, Morty's understanding of what the relationship actually is has become considerably more sophisticated than it was in the pilot, when he was just a boy who thought his grandfather was taking him on trips because he was special. He has learned what the Morty function is, he has seen the strings, he still shows up. The choice to keep showing up, made from a position of much greater knowledge about what showing up costs, is the character's most defining quality in the later seasons, and the thing the more devoted part of the fandom finds most worth defending. The moments that produced the strongest fan responses across the run are mostly moments where Morty's feeling breaks through the accumulated toughness and lands with the clarity of the early seasons. The speech in Ricksty Minutes where he talks Summer down from the ledge of her own despair by explaining that he has buried himself in a backyard and decided the only sane response is to stop looking for cosmic significance and come watch television, is one of the most quoted scenes in the show's history. It works because the nihilism is delivered by the character least naturally suited to nihilism, and because the warmth underneath it is unmistakable. He is not delivering Rick's philosophy because he has become Rick. He is delivering it because he has lived inside it long enough to find the part of it that is actually kind. The part that says the absence of grand meaning does not have to be devastating because the small things in front of you are still real. That is not a reading Rick himself tends to make, and the fact that Morty finds it is one of the clearest signs that the two of them, for all the ways the show draws them toward each other, are still different people at the center. The fan community has also paid close attention to Morty's developing ability to resist Rick's manipulation, and treats that development as one of the show's most meaningful, long arcs. Early season Morty can be steered with relatively little effort. Rick knows which combination of flattery and guilt and implication will produce the result he wants, and he applies it with the casual precision of someone who has done it so many times it no longer requires deliberate thought. By the later seasons, the same moves land differently. Morty sees more of them coming. He calls some of them out. He refuses the role he was cast in often enough that the refusal has become a recurring note in the relationship, rather than an isolated event. He has not freed himself from Rick's orbit, and the show suggests that he may not want to entirely. But he has learned to navigate that orbit with considerably more awareness of its mechanics. And the fandom treats that learning as an achievement worth the years of difficulty it took to arrive at. The show's handling of Morty's mental and emotional state is another area where the writing takes risks that the audience divides over. The fourth season arc, centered around the Death Crystals, is the clearest example. A storyline where Morty's fixation on a single possible death gradually crowds out everything else until he is barely functional. The show does not play this lightly. It follows the spiral into territory that is genuinely uncomfortable to watch, and it does not produce a clean resolution so much as a return to the baseline instability that constitutes normal life for this character. Fans who appreciate that honesty find it among the most resonant things the show has done with Morty. Fans who find it painful to watch without the relief of a clear recovery are also not wrong about what they are experiencing. The show chose to go there and not to make it easy afterward, and that choice has consequences for how the fandom holds Morty's later seasons. His relationship with Summer has grown into one of the quieter pleasures the show offers, particularly in later seasons where their dynamic has developed enough history to carry real weight. They are siblings who have been through things that most siblings do not have to survive, and who have handled the same experiences in different directions. Morty by feeling too much, and Summer by learning to feel strategically. And the moments where those two approaches come into contact tend to produce some of the more grounded scenes in a show that is rarely interested in the ground. The fandom's affection for this relationship is less loud than the feelings generated by Rick and Morty as a pair, but it runs deep in the part of the audience that has been paying attention to the smaller things the show does between the cosmic set pieces. Morty Smith works as a character across 8 seasons of increasingly difficult material because the show never fully abandoned the thing that made him worth following in the first place. Underneath the trauma and the hardening and the moral complexity that the later seasons layer onto him, there is still a person who feels things, who notices when something is wrong, who shows up for the people he loves, even knowing what it costs. The show has made showing up harder for him with every passing season, and he keeps doing it anyway. Not with the effortless goodness of the early seasons, but with the qualified, complicated, earned goodness of someone who has learned exactly how much it takes and decided it is still worth the price. The fandom grew with him through all of that, and the love on the other side of it is more durable than the simpler version that existed at the beginning, because it has been tested in ways that simpler attachments never are. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show's emotional core spent 8 seasons being tested, hardened, and complicated without being broken, and the fandom held on through all of it. Next, the story moves away from the main duo and into the characters who built devoted followings from the margins, the side players who showed up for one episode or a handful of scenes and somehow never left the audience's imagination. Section 4. The characters who stole every room they walked into. Rick and Morty has never been stingy about building out its edges. Where most animated comedies reserve their creative energy for the main cast and treat supporting players as delivery systems for single jokes, this show keeps finding ways to make the margins matter. The characters who live out there, the ones who appear for one episode or surface in scattered scenes across several seasons, have generated some of the most durable affection in the entire fandom. 3 of them stand apart from the rest. Not because they are the most plot relevant or the most frequently seen, but because something in how they were built landed with the audience in a way that outlasted every scene they were given. Mr. Meeseeks arrived and became a mascot inside a single episode. Mr. Poopy Butthole appeared from nowhere and made the fandom care about him before it had any reason to. Bird Person stood in a corner at a party and became, across years of patient storytelling, one of the emotional pillars of the whole series. Mr. Meeseeks was born in the writer's room from an act of boredom. Justin Roiland, frustrated with a story that was not coming together, started yelling the character's name and catchphrase, and the energy in the room changed. What emerged from that afternoon became one of the most immediately iconic things the show has ever produced. Introduced in the first season episode Meeseeks and Destroy, the Meeseeks are blue creatures summoned from a box Rick hands to his family as a convenience, each one called into existence for a single task and designed to dissolve once that task is complete. They are cheerful, eager, screechy-voiced, and desperately grateful when the job is simple enough to let them finish quickly and cease to exist. They describe their own experience of being alive as pain. They are not being dramatic. The show means it. The joke that drives the episode is deceptively simple. Rick warns the family to keep the requests manageable. Jerry asks a Meeseeks to help him shave 2 strokes off his golf game. Jerry, being Jerry, does not improve. The Meeseeks cannot complete its task, cannot cease to exist, and begins to suffer the prolonged agony of a being designed for temporary service that has been trapped in permanence by a man who cannot learn to keep his elbow in. It summons more Meeseeks to help. Those Meeseeks also fail. The colony of stranded, suffering creatures accumulates until the episode tips into chaos and then into something approaching genuine horror. A crowd of beings in existential agony whose only crime was being assigned to someone fundamentally unable to change. The fandom's response to Mr. Meeseeks was immediate and disproportionate to his screen time, which tells you something about why the character works. He is, on paper, a one-off gag creature, a punchline with a catchphrase. What the writing did that a lesser show would not have bothered to do is give him an inner life. The Meeseeks knows it is suffering. The Meeseeks knows why it is suffering. It can articulate the problem with Jerry's golf swing. It can argue with other Meeseeks about methodology. It experiences something that reads unmistakably as despair when the task refuses to yield. A creature of this kind, given this much interiority in a single episode, stops being a joke and becomes something the audience cannot help but feel for, even while the situation generating that feeling is being played entirely for laughs. The catchphrase, delivered in Roiland's high-pitched, slightly unhinged voice, became a genuine cultural shorthand almost immediately. The merchandise followed. The cameos in later episodes followed. The character had earned enough of a place in the fandom's imagination that the show could drop a Meeseeks into a background scene and trust that a significant portion of the audience would notice and respond. What started as a writer screaming in a room became the most quoted side character in the show's first season. And that trajectory from impulse to icon is one of the clearest demonstrations of how this show tends to work. The best things in it often arrive sideways, generated by creative instinct rather than calculation, and the audience can feel that quality of aliveness in the result. Mr. Poopy Butthole operates through a completely different mechanism and produces a completely different kind of affection. He appears in the second season episode Total Recall, introduced alongside a swarm of memory parasites that are infiltrating the Smith household by taking the forms of beloved friends and implanting false recollections of shared history. The episode's central horror is that the family cannot trust their own memories, cannot know which of the cheerful, colorful figures suddenly populating their home are real, and which are parasitic fabrications feeding on their emotional connections. The resolution hinges on a rule the show establishes mid-episode, that the parasites can only create happy memories, meaning that any figure who exists exclusively in warm recollections with no negative experiences attached is almost certainly not real. Mr. Poopy Butthole is a small yellow creature in a top hat who calls himself a longtime family friend and who, when Beth searches her memory for a single negative experience involving him, comes up empty. The episode has trained the audience to read that absence as proof of fabrication. Beth reads it that way. She shoots him. He is real. He is bleeding on the floor. The look on his face, the genuine hurt and confusion of someone who has just been shot by a person he considered a friend, lands with a force completely disproportionate to the amount of time the show has spent establishing who he is. He has been on screen for minutes. The audience is devastated for him. What happens next is the thing that turned Mr. Poopy Butthole from a clever episode gag into a recurring fan favorite. The show does not let his injury be the end of him, or the beginning of a simple recovery. His post-credits appearances across subsequent seasons are among the most quietly melancholy things the series has produced. Small windows into a life playing out in real time while the main plot moves elsewhere. He is shown in a rehabilitation facility after the shooting, moving with a cane, working through his recovery with the cheerful resilience of someone who genuinely has not let what happened to him make him bitter. Later, he has gotten his GED. Later still, he has a wife and a child. Later, the marriage has fallen apart and he is alone again. He makes brief addresses to the audience from the edges of episodes, warm and slightly heartbroken and relentlessly optimistic. And the fandom has followed every one of these updates with the kind of attention people usually reserve for characters who have been given much more time and space. The reason is that Mr. Poopy Butthole accidentally became the show's most sustained argument that life keeps going regardless of whether the main narrative is paying attention. He exists in the gaps between Rick's adventures, aging and recovering, and loving and losing in the way people do when no story is watching. His fourth wall-breaking addresses to the audience have a quality of intimacy that the main cast rarely achieves, partly because he is speaking directly, and partly because his life, for all its bizarre details, follows a recognizably human shape. He gets shot by a friend who made a reasonable mistake, and he forgives her, and he keeps living. That act of continuity, of stubbornly persisting through damage without becoming defined by it, is something the audience finds genuinely moving in a show that usually treats damage as either comedy or tragedy, and rarely as the background hum of an ordinary life. Bird Person is a different kind of achievement entirely. He first appears in the first season finale, Rixie Business, at a party, tall and winged, and delivered with an absolutely flat affect, translating Rick's signature catchphrase to its real meaning, which turns out to be an expression of great pain. He is funny in the way a completely sincere character is funny in a show full of ironic ones, because the contrast between his gravity and the chaos surrounding him is immediate and total. He makes a single observation, and the audience understands something it did not know before, both about the phrase it has been hearing all season and about the man who uses it. That economy, that much information moved that efficiently in that few lines is the hallmark of excellent supporting character writing, and the fandom noticed it immediately. What the show then did with Bird Person over the following seasons was build him slowly into the most important figure in Rick's emotional history. The details accumulated across episodes that were not primarily about him. A comment here, a flashback there, a shared look between two people who have known each other through things neither of them fully discusses in front of other people. The picture that assembled itself over time was of a friendship forged in genuine danger. Two beings who fought side by side against a galactic power that dwarfed both of them, and who came out the other side with the kind of bond that does not require regular maintenance, because it was built under conditions that tested everything. Bird Person is one of the very few people who knew Rick before the bitterness finished hardening, and that knowledge gives him a quality of understanding no other character in the show shares. He knows the version of Rick that existed before the loss. The fact that he chooses to remain Rick's friend, with full knowledge of what the man has become, is treated by the show as a profound act rather than a simple one. His death at his own wedding in the second season finale is the moment the show converted the fandom's warm appreciation for Bird Person into something considerably more intense. His bride, revealed to be a deep cover agent for the Galactic Federation, shoots him at the reception. The scene is staged not as a plot twist, but as a genuine loss, and the audience feels it as one because the writing has spent 2 seasons earning it. He is brought back in the 3rd season as the cybernetic Phoenix Person, his mind overwritten, his body weaponized, his loyalty to Rick converted into its opposite, and the horror of that transformation is specifically the horror of watching someone who was defined by quiet steadiness turned into an instrument of destruction. The fandom's reaction to Phoenix Person was not the response to a villain. It was the response to a beloved person in a situation they did not deserve. The restoration arc in the 6th season, in which Rick enters the ruins of Bird Person's mind to pull him back from the damage that has been done, gave the fandom something it had wanted since the wedding. Not a simple rescue, but an honest reckoning with history. Inside Bird Person's memories, Rick is confronted with his own past, the war, the choices, the friendship from before everything else. And the sequence operates as the most direct emotional labor the show has ever required of him. He stays, He does the work. He brings his friend back. The fandom's response to that arc was among the most intense of any storyline in the later seasons, because it paid off years of patient storytelling and gave Birdperson the dignity his history had earned. What all three of these characters share, despite being as different as characters can be, is that the show gave them interiority at a moment when the audience was not expecting it. Mr. Meeseeks is a disposable service creature with a devastating awareness of his own pain. Mr. Poopy Butthole is a joke name on a walking punchline who turns out to be one of the most genuinely decent presences in the show's universe. Birdperson is a background figure at a party who turns out to be the keeper of everything important about the main character's real history. In each case, the show built more than the scene required, and the surplus is exactly where the fandom's love lives. The characters who become beloved from the margins tend to become beloved because they reveal something about the world of the show that the main cast, by virtue of being the main cast, cannot reveal. Rick and Morty as a pair are too central to the narrative to carry the specific quality of accidental honesty that a Birdperson or a Mr. Poopy Butthole carries. A character who is not carrying the plot can afford to simply be something without the weight of thematic obligation. Mr. Meeseeks exists purely to demonstrate that consciousness is painful and Jerry is unteachable. Mr. Poopy Butthole exists to be someone the universe has genuinely wronged who refuses to become bitter about it. Birdperson exists to be the proof that Rick was once worth following into fire. Each of them carries one true thing, cleanly and without complication. And in a show this committed to complexity, the purity of that single true thing is its own form of relief. The fandom holds on to them partly for that reason. They are uncomplicated loves in a show that rarely offers those. Rick requires ongoing negotiation, a constant recalibration of how much to forgive and how much to hold. Morty requires watching someone the audience cares about get harder to watch over time. The side characters who became beloved do not ask for any of that. They simply arrive, offer the thing they are built to offer, and earn their place in the audience's imagination by being exactly what they are, without reservation. In a show about the impossibility of certainty and the absence of fixed meaning, a character who is simply and completely itself is, in its own way, the most comforting thing the multiverse has to offer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Three characters built their devoted followings from the edges of the show, offering the fandom uncomplicated love in a series that rarely provides it. Next, the story turns to the show's most beloved villain, the one who spent years hiding in plain sight and broke the fandom open the moment it finally understood what he had been doing all along. Section 5. Evil Morty, the villain the fandom adopted. The name was never in the script. The production team credited the character simply as Morty's across every episode he appeared in during the early seasons, and the show itself did not say the name aloud until the 5th season finale. The fandom named him Evil Morty because it needed something to call the thing it had noticed, and what it had noticed, before the writers confirmed any of it, was that one specific Morty was doing something none of the others were. He was thinking. He was planning. He was, in a show where every Morty is by definition defined by his relationship to a Rick, operating without one. The audience recognized that as significant before it understood why, and the years of theorizing that followed that recognition turned Evil Morty into something unusual in the landscape of fan culture. He became beloved before he was fully understood, and more beloved still once the understanding arrived. His introduction in the first season episode, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, is one of the great slow reveals in the show's history. The episode appears to be about a Rick who has gone rogue, killing other Ricks across the multiverse, using Mortys in grotesque ways to mask his brainwave signature. Rick C-137 is framed for the crimes and hunted by the Council of Ricks. The actual villain, revealed in the final minutes, is not the Rick at all. The Rick has been controlled the entire time by a Morty wearing an eye patch, a device that reverses the masking effect and allows a Morty's intelligence to operate without a Rick's interference. In a world where every Morty is a sidekick and every Rick is a genius, one Morty has turned the entire dynamic inside out and used the multiverse's assumptions against it. The episode ends with him slipping back into a crowd of rescued Mortys, indistinguishable, gone. The fandom's response to that reveal was immediate and sustained. Threads appeared within hours, theories multiplied. The question of who this Morty was, what he wanted, and whether he was connected to the Morty the audience had been following became one of the show's most active, ongoing conversations. The writers had introduced a mystery with no explanation attached, in a show that had not yet established a strong habit of serialized storytelling. And the combination of a genuinely shocking premise and a complete absence of resolution was exactly the formula for generating the kind of obsessive fan engagement that builds a character's reputation between appearances. What the fandom was responding to, underneath the excitement of a mystery, was something more specific. Evil Morty violated the show's most fundamental rule. In a universe where the central finite curve had been quietly constructed to ensure that every reality contained a Rick who was the smartest being present, a Morty who could outmaneuver a Rick was not just an anomaly. He was a structural impossibility made flesh, and the fact that he existed proved something the show had not yet said outright about the nature of the multiverse the characters were operating in. The audience felt that implication before it could articulate it. Something about the basic arrangement of the world was wrong, and this Morty knew it and was doing something about it. The feeling that a secret was being approached from an unexpected angle is one of the most compelling experiences a long-running story can produce, and Evil Morty produced it in his very first scene. His return in the third season episode The Ricklantis Mix-Up, released under the alternate title Tales from the Citadel, is widely considered one of the best episodes the show has produced across its entire run. The episode abandons the main characters entirely to spend its runtime inside the Citadel of Ricks, exploring the society of Ricks and Mortys who live there as a functioning civilization. It follows multiple storylines simultaneously: a factory worker Rick, a cop Rick and cop Morty partnership, a Morty running for Citadel president on a platform of dignity for his kind. The presidential campaign is the thread that builds to the episode's conclusion. The Morty candidate gives speeches about equality and representation. He builds genuine support among the Morty underclass. He wins the election. He is Evil Morty. The final shot of the episode shows him at the president's desk, surrounded by the bodies of the Council of Ricks he has just had eliminated, looking out over the Citadel with the calm of someone who has been working toward this for a very long time and finds the arrival exactly as unremarkable as he expected it to be. The episode ends there. No explanation, no confrontation. No Rick to catch him or challenge him or even yet realize what has happened. The fandom responded with something close to awe, because the episode had just demonstrated that Evil Morty was not a one-off villain or a shock value twist. He was a long game, and the long game was running inside the show's own institutions, using the structures the Ricks built to guarantee their supremacy as the ladder he climbed to dismantle them. The love that the fandom had been building for this character since his first appearance converted at that moment into something closer to devotion. Evil Morty was doing what no other character in the show had managed to do on his terms and at his scale. He was beating Rick. Not through superior firepower or a lucky break or the intervention of a plot that required a villain to succeed for dramatic reasons. He was beating Rick by understanding Rick, by grasping with complete clarity the arrogance that made the Ricks predictable, the absolute certainty that no Morty could threaten them, and building his entire strategy on that single blind spot. He weaponized the thing they were most sure of. He used their confidence in the rigged board against them. The specific quality of that strategy is worth examining because it explains a great deal about why the fandom adopted him so completely. Evil Morty is not evil in the way television villains are usually evil. He does not want power for its own sake. He does not have a personal grudge he is trying to resolve, or a wound he is trying to cauterize by causing equivalent wounds in others. What he wants, stripped to its core, is the most understandable thing in the show's universe. He wants out. He wants to leave a system built specifically to ensure that beings like him remain at the bottom, to escape a multiverse that has been curated to make certain that he is never the important one in any room, and to reach the part of reality that exists beyond the wall the Ricks built to protect themselves from fair comparison. His goal is not conquest, it is freedom. The fandom fell for that because freedom, from a system that was designed from the beginning to exclude you, is the most sympathetic possible motivation for a character labeled a villain. His 5th season finale appearance in Rick, Morty, Jack is where the plan completes and the fandom gets the payoff to years of waiting. Evil Morty has seized control of the Citadel. He has built a weapon capable of breaching the central finite curve. He delivers a monologue to Rick that is the closest the show has ever come to a direct articulation of its own thesis, laying out in plain terms the nature of the curve, what it was built to do, and what it cost everyone inside it. He tells Rick that the curve is not a universe, it is a cage. It was built by Ricks who could not tolerate the possibility of a reality where they were ordinary, and everything inside it, every adventure, every conquest, every demonstration of genius has taken place within walls those Ricks built specifically to guarantee the outcome. Then he blows the wall open and walks through into the part of existence that has never contained a Rick and never been filtered to ensure one. And the show lets him go. No defeat, no heroic recapture. He simply leaves into a freedom no other character in the show has managed to reach. The fandom's response to that conclusion was the most intense, sustained discussion the show had generated since the 3rd season premiere. The disagreements were genuine and ran deep. Some fans felt the ending was perfect, that Evil Morty had always been heading toward exactly this, and that his exit was the only honest conclusion his arc could reach. Others felt robbed of a confrontation, wanting the collision between Evil Morty and Rick C137 that years of buildup seemed to be promising. Both responses were sincere, and both were produced by the same quality in the writing, which had made Evil Morty matter enough that any conclusion to his story was going to feel simultaneously right and insufficient, the way conclusions to things that have mattered for a long time tend to feel. What the fandom kept returning to in the months and years after the finale was the monologue. Not because it was a villain speech in the traditional sense, full of gloating or cruelty or declarations of superiority, because it was, functionally, an explanation. Evil Morty was not addressing Rick to defeat him or humiliate him. He was addressing him because he wanted Rick to understand something, to see clearly the nature of the world he had built and what it had cost everyone inside it, including himself. The monologue has been quoted and analyzed and argued over more than almost any single scene in the show's recent seasons. And the reason is that it speaks directly to the show's deepest preoccupation, the question of what it means to be powerful inside a system built specifically to make you look powerful, and what it costs to mistake that arrangement for actual supremacy. His appearance in the 7th season episode Unmortrican added a final layer to the portrait. Returning without announcement to assist Rick in the hunt for Rick Prime, he operates with the same calm competence and the same complete absence of interest in Rick's gratitude or approval. He helps because it serves his purposes, leaves when it no longer does, and offers Rick no satisfaction about his own motivations. The interaction confirms everything the fandom had understood about him. He is not defined by Rick. He is not in opposition to Rick in the way a traditional nemesis is defined by its opposite. He has simply moved past the entire framework in which Rick is the central figure, and his presence in the episode functions as a reminder that the world outside the central finite curve contains beings for whom Rick's supremacy was always a local and temporary arrangement rather than a cosmic fact. The fandom loves Evil Morty for everything that list implies. He is the character who told the truth the show had been approaching from every other angle for years, and he told it directly and without sentiment, and then left. He demonstrated that the intelligence the show celebrates in Rick is real but bounded, that the stage was always smaller than the story suggested, and that someone with less raw power but more clarity about the nature of the game could walk out of it entirely while the smartest man in the universe was still playing. In a show about what intelligence can and cannot do for a person, Evil Morty is the answer to a question no one else in the cast was positioned to answer. He showed the audience what it looks like to use understanding as liberation rather than as control, and to actually leave rather than spending a lifetime building elaborate reasons why leaving is impossible. He is also, and this matters to the specific texture of the fandom's feeling for him, sympathetic without being soft. The crimes he commits on the way to his goal are real, and the show does not disguise them. People die. Institutions are destroyed. The Citadel, whatever its failings, was also a home to beings who had not personally chosen to be part of a system that exploited others, and its destruction carried costs the episode does not pretend away. Evil Morty is aware of this and proceeds anyway, because he has decided that the alternative, remaining inside the cage, is worse. The fandom largely agrees with that decision, not because it has failed to count the cost, but because the show has made the cage vivid enough that the cost of staying in it is also legible. He is a character who asks the audience to hold two things at once: genuine admiration for the clarity of his vision, and genuine awareness of the damage the vision required. And the audience has proven willing to hold both, which is the show asking something real of the people watching it. The name the fandom gave him before the show confirmed it, the years of theories it built around him before the writing caught up to the anticipation, the intensity of the response when the payoff arrived, all of it adds up to a portrait of a character who earned his place in the audience's imagination, not through the usual mechanisms of likability or relatability, but through something rarer. He was right. He saw the thing the show was building toward before most of the characters inside the story could see it, and he acted on it with a patience and a precision that the audience could not help but recognize as a form of genius the show usually reserves for Rick alone. The fandom gave its love to Evil Morty because he was the character who finally, in the plainest possible terms, named the size of the cage and walked out of it. And that act, in a show about all the brilliant ways a person can avoid the one true thing they need to face, is the most radical thing anyone in the story has ever done. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show's most beloved villain earned his fandom by doing the one thing no other character managed: seeing the cage clearly and walking out of it without looking back. Next, the focus shifts entirely, away from the loved and toward the despised, beginning with the character who absorbed more sustained fan hostility than anyone else in the show's history, and what that hostility actually reveals. Section 6. Jerry Smith, the man the fandom decided it could not forgive. Every show with a character like Jerry Smith eventually has the same argument. The argument starts with one group of fans explaining at length and with genuine heat why the character is unbearable, and it ends with a smaller but equally passionate group pointing out that the hatred directed at him reveals something uncomfortable about the people doing the hating. Rick and Morty has been having this argument since the first season, and it has never fully resolved, which is itself the most interesting thing about it. A character who generates this much sustained negative feeling across this many seasons from this many people who are otherwise in agreement about almost everything else the show does is not generating that feeling by accident. Jerry Smith is the most carefully constructed object of audience frustration in the show's history. Built with precision, deployed with purpose, and understood least clearly by the people who despise him most. The surface case against Jerry is straightforward, and the show builds it steadily across every season it has aired. He is the weakest person in any room he occupies. He lacks self-awareness in ways that consistently make things worse for the people around him. He reaches for approval from sources that have made clear they will never provide it. He develops an app against his son's advice, accelerates an alien invasion, and is surprised by the consequence. He makes Beth choose between him and her father at a moment when he is fully aware of what that choice costs her emotionally. And he makes it anyway because his need to win the argument outweighs his ability to weigh the damage. He is, in the specific taxonomy the show establishes, the anti-Rick, a man whose ordinariness becomes visible and unbearable precisely because of who he is standing next to. And the show uses that contrast with the consistency of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. The fandom absorbed all of that and decided, early and emphatically, that Jerry was the problem. Not Rick's cruelty, not the manipulation of a child across multiple dimensions, not the various planetary catastrophes generated by careless brilliance and inadequate afterthought. Jerry, the man who cannot keep his elbow in during a golf swing, who bakes muffins while his family navigates an interdimensional crisis, who needs to be liked by people who have demonstrated no interest in liking him. The disproportion between the actual harm Jerry causes and the intensity of the fandom's response to him is the clearest signal that something other than the show's own morality is doing the work here. What is doing the work, and what the show's writers understood when they built Jerry, is identification. The fandom for Rick and Morty skews toward people who experience intelligence as a core part of their identity, who value cleverness, who enjoy the experience of keeping up with a fast and complicated story, and who have, in many cases, organized a significant portion of their self-image around the idea that they are more like Rick than like the other people around them. That self-image is exactly what Jerry threatens. He is not threatening in the way a villain is threatening. He is threatening in the way a mirror angled at an unflattering angle is threatening. Because what he reflects is not an enemy, but a possibility. The possibility that the gap between the audience member and the mediocre man on screen is narrower than the audience member would prefer to believe. The show is not subtle about this. In the 5th season episode A Mordecai Grick, a group of aliens who derive pleasure from the suffering of others become devoted fans of Jerry, specifically because his lack of self-awareness provides them with a constant stream of entertainment. They call his failures delicious. They praise what they describe as his oafish need to be liked. The episode is a comedy, but the joke it is making is aimed directly at the segment of the fandom that consumes Jerry's humiliations with the same enjoyment. And the show is comfortable making that parallel visible. The audience laughing at Jerry is, the episode quietly suggests, not as different from those aliens as it might prefer to think. The cruelty of the enjoyment is the point. Jerry's actual record across the series is more complicated than the fandom's response to him tends to acknowledge. He is, genuinely, the most normal human being in the show, and normality in this context means something specific. He wants a stable home. He wants his marriage to work. He wants his children to be safe. He wants to feel useful and valued by the people he loves. These are not contemptible desires. In a different show, surrounded by people who shared those values, Jerry would be sympathetic, possibly even admirable. The problem is that the show he is in regards those desires as, at best, irrelevant, and at worst, as evidence of an essential smallness. And the gravitational pull of Rick's perspective on the world is strong enough that the audience tends to adopt that evaluation without fully noticing it has done so. Rick hates Jerry for reasons the show spells out carefully. Jerry got Beth pregnant as a teenager, derailing what Rick imagined would be his daughter's future as a person as extraordinary as he believed himself to be. Rick holds Jerry responsible for the limitation of Beth's life in ways that are themselves a form of arrogance, since they rest on the assumption that Rick's evaluation of Beth's potential is accurate, and that Jerry is the obstacle between her and it, rather than a person she chose and has continued choosing. The show does not fully endorse Rick's reading of the situation, but it gives that reading so much airtime and delivers it with such comic conviction that the audience absorbs it as the correct frame. By the time a viewer has seen Rick dismiss Jerry across enough episodes, the dismissal starts to feel like a verdict. What the show does with careful regularity alongside the dismissal is demonstrate that Jerry's perspective is not without its own validity. His observation in the third season episode The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy, that his life was ordinary and content before Rick reappeared in it and converted a functional family into a recurring crisis, is not wrong. He does not have the intellectual framework to articulate why the Smith household's relationship with Rick is damaging in the specific ways it is. But his sense that something has been altered and that the alteration has cost him something real is not a product of his inadequacy. It is a product of accurate observation. He is wrong about almost everything related to how to respond to that observation, which is where his culpability lives, but the observation itself is sound. The divorce storyline in the third season is where the show tests the limits of the fandom's patience with Jerry most directly and most productively. Beth and Jerry separate. Rick reasserts himself as the center of the household, and Jerry is briefly free of the orbit that has been crushing him for 2 seasons of television. What the show does with that freedom is not what a story contemptuous of Jerry would do. It gives him a real arc, a period of genuine struggle and adaptation, followed by a relationship with an alien woman who finds him genuinely appealing, which is played not for humiliation, but for the specific humor of a man discovering that in a different context, with different people, he can be something other than the family joke. The show does not let this last. The reconciliation with Beth happens, and Jerry returns to the gravitational field. But the episode that shows him genuinely thriving outside that field is a crucial piece of information that the portion of the fandom committed to despising him tends to discount. His relationship with Doofus Rick, the one variant of Rick who treats Jerry with warmth rather than contempt, is the most efficient argument the show makes for taking Jerry seriously. Doofus Rick is explicitly identified as the one version of Rick across all of the Citadel who is actually kind, who cares about people as a matter of genuine disposition rather than calculation. He and Jerry become friends. The friendship is played for comedy because the contrast between Doofus Rick's gentle domesticity and the chaos of the usual Rick dynamic is inherently funny. But underneath the comedy is a specific and non-trivial point. The version of Rick who is best at being a person is the one who finds Jerry worth spending time with. That is not nothing, and the show puts it there deliberately. The writing also uses Jerry to explore something the rest of the family, bound by proximity to Rick's worldview, cannot access. He is the only regular character who consistently treats the question of whether a given adventure is worth the cost in human terms rather than in terms of how interesting it is or how much it demonstrates about the nature of the universe. When Rick's schemes damage the family, Jerry is frequently the one who names the damage in the plainest terms available. He is usually dismissed when he does this, by Rick, by Beth, sometimes by his own children, and the dismissal is played for comedy. But the thing he is saying is usually true. His function in the narrative is partly to be the character who says the true thing in the wrong register, with the wrong authority, without the credentials that would make the people around him stop laughing long enough to hear it. The fandom's sustained hostility toward him reflects a dynamic the show is consciously probing. Within Rick and Morty's specific community, being Jerry is treated as a category of failure, a shorthand for a kind of inadequacy that smart, self-aware fans congratulate themselves on having avoided. The phrase being used as an insult inside the fandom, describing someone's behavior or reasoning as very Jerry, captures this perfectly. It is a way of saying that a person has failed to be sufficiently intelligent, self-aware, or interesting, deployed by people who identify strongly with Rick's values. The show anticipated this usage. The writers built a character specifically designed to become this kind of cultural shorthand, and then they built in the critique of that usage, quietly and with the patience of people who know their audience well enough to predict exactly how it will respond. The critique is most direct in the 4th season episode, One Crew Over the Crew-Coo's Morty, which touches on the show's awareness of its own fan dynamics, and in the general pattern of episodes that give Jerry moments of genuine competence or genuine dignity before the next humiliation arrives. He is not kept consistently pathetic because the writers think he deserves to be. He is kept in that position because the show is examining what it looks like for a person to be surrounded by people who have decided, before the evidence is in, that he does not deserve better. Rick made that decision. The family adopted it by proximity. The fandom adopted it by watching. The show keeps asking, in the small moments between the bigger jokes, whether the decision was ever fair. None of this means Jerry is an easy character to watch. He is not. His failures are real and their consequences are real, and the show earns every groan the audience directs at him across 8 seasons of poor choices and missed opportunities. He is selfish in ways that cause genuine harm. He is capable of a particular kind of emotional manipulation that the show surfaces with enough honesty that the people who defend him cannot fully ignore it. He pressures Beth in ways that are recognizable as controlling, regardless of how sympathetic his underlying anxiety is. He is not a victim of the fandom's cruelty. He is a complicated person who deserves a complicated reading. And the most honest version of the fandom's relationship with him would acknowledge that both things are true at once. What makes Jerry the most interesting character in the show's hate column is that the hate directed at him is, more than with any other character, a choice the audience is making about itself. Hating Rick is complicated by genuine admiration and the grief underneath his worst behavior. Hating characters like Tammy or King Jellybean involves responding to specific acts of cruelty that the show presents as categorically wrong. Hating Jerry requires deciding that ordinary human limitation is something worth despising. And that decision, made by a fandom that congratulates itself on its intelligence and sophistication, is the most uncomfortable thing the show keeps holding up for examination. The writers knew what they were building. A character designed to be hated by a particular kind of audience for reasons that reflect that audience's own values back at it is a sophisticated piece of social engineering. And Rick and Morty has been running that particular experiment on its own viewers since the pilot. The fandom fell for it completely, which is exactly what makes it so effective. Jerry is not the worst person in the show. He is not even close. He is simply the person the show's specific audience is most structurally likely to despise. And the consistency with which that despising arrives, season after season, in people who consider themselves thoughtful and perceptive viewers, is the funniest joke the show has been running across its entire history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fandom's most sustained hostility turned out to be a mirror aimed at the audience itself, a joke the show has been running since the beginning on the people least likely to realize they are the punchline. Next, the focus turns to a character whose fan reception split down entirely different lines. A woman who divides the audience not because of what she lacks, but because of what she inherited. Section 7. Beth Smith, the character the show could not decide how to judge. Beth Smith is the only main character in Rick and Morty whose fan reception mirrors the show's own apparent uncertainty about her. Rick is complicated but coherent. Jerry is simple, and the show knows exactly what it is doing with him. Morty is changing in a direction the writing has chosen deliberately and tracked with care. Beth exists in a space where the script seemed to be working something out that the writers have not entirely settled. pulling her toward a harsh verdict in one episode and a sympathetic one in the next. And the audience has split along exactly those fault lines, with a consistency that is held across every season since the pilot. Some fans find her one of the most honest portraits of a specific kind of damage the show has produced. Others find her increasingly difficult to defend. The split is not about missing information or different interpretations of the same scenes. It is about genuinely different things the show has done with the same character across 8 seasons of inconsistent attention. And the inconsistency is the most revealing thing about how the series has handled the person it arguably had the most interesting material to work with from the beginning. The version of Beth that arrives in the pilot is a recognizable type, handled with more care than the type usually receives. She is a horse surgeon, competent and professionally respected, stuck in a marriage she knows is not working, reunited with a father who abandoned her childhood, and around whom she has organized a significant portion of her adult identity. The dynamic between her and Rick is the most emotionally complicated thing the early seasons offer, because it is built on the specific damage that an absent, brilliant parent does to a child who inherits the intelligence without inheriting the context that would make that intelligence feel like a stable foundation. Beth is smart, and she knows she is smart, and she has spent her whole life unable to determine whether that intelligence is genuinely comparable to her father's, or whether she has simply been told it is as a substitute for the sustained presence that would have told her something real. That uncertainty is the most honest thing about her in the early seasons, and the thing the fandom responds to most warmly, because it is a recognizable form of damage, even to people who have not lived it directly. The specific loneliness of someone who has been praised instead of known. Rick's relationship with that uncertainty is one of the darker threads running through the show's first few seasons. He does not resolve Beth's doubt. He could. A father who wanted his daughter to have a clear sense of her own worth would offer the kind of sustained, honest assessment that closes the question rather than keeping it alive as a source of ongoing need. Rick offers approval in carefully rationed doses, enough to maintain the craving without satisfying it, which is the behavior of someone who has understood that her need for his validation is useful to him and has decided to manage it accordingly rather than address it. The show stages this with enough clarity that the audience can see the mechanics even when Beth cannot, and the gap between what Beth experiences as her relationship with her father and what the audience can observe about what that relationship is actually doing to her is one of the most genuinely painful things the show produces in its quieter moments. It is also the clearest early demonstration that Rick's manipulation does not require conscious cruelty to cause real harm. The management of Beth's approval need is so habitual it barely qualifies as a decision anymore. It is simply the shape of the relationship, and Beth moves inside that shape without fully seeing it, which is exactly how the most durable damage tends to work. The early fandom's warmth toward Beth was genuine, and the reasons for it were real. She was one of the few adults in the show's world who was doing something professionally worthwhile, who had built a competence outside her family relationships that she could point to as evidence of who she was independent of Rick. The early seasons used her professional confidence as a contrast to her domestic uncertainty in ways that gave her texture. A person who could be decisive and authoritative in one context and paralyzing second-guessing herself in another, depending entirely on whether Rick was in the room. That specific portrait resonated with a portion of the fandom that recognized the shape of it from their own experience, and the recognition produced the kind of warm feeling toward a character that tends to survive a great deal of subsequent difficulty. Where Beth becomes harder for the fandom to follow is in the third season episode, The ABCs of Beth, which presents the most direct portrait of her inner life the show had offered to that point, and manages to make it considerably more alarming than the early seasons positioned the audience to expect. Rick reveals that Beth, as a child, was not simply gifted, but actively frightening. A child whose imagination for cruelty and whose appetite for violence as a solution required him to build her an elaborate fantasy world to contain her away from the neighborhood. He describes her younger self with a wariness he usually reserves for things that have genuinely threatened him. And the episode neither fully confirms nor fully denies that the description is accurate. It holds the possibility open. And what it does with that possibility is to suggest that Beth's current struggles are not only the product of Rick's abandonment, but also the product of something that was already there before the abandonment had time to do its work. Something the absence left without adequate guidance, and that the guidance, had it arrived, might not have been fully able to shape. The fandom split on this material immediately, and has never fully come back together. One reading treats the revelation as a continuation of the show's honest portrait of generational damage, suggesting that what looks like nascent sociopathy in young Beth is simply the raw and unformed version of Rick's own traits. The genius and the moral flexibility and the willingness to treat other beings as means rather than ends, which, without a present parent to shape it, hardened in directions it did not have to go. This reading finds Beth sympathetic, even in her worst moments, because it situates those moments inside a history that explains them, without fully excusing them. And it treats the question of what she might have become with more care behind her as one of the saddest hypotheticals the show raises. Another reading treats the episode as evidence that the show has been building toward a verdict the early seasons were too protective of her to deliver clearly. That she is not simply a victim of her father's absence, but a genuinely difficult person, whose harm to the people around her cannot be fully accounted for by pointing at Rick indefinitely. And that the show's reluctance to say so outright is itself a form of the same avoidance it diagnoses in the family. Her relationship with Jerry lives at the center of the debate, because it is where Beth's behavior toward another person is most visible and most sustained across the run of the series. The marriage is something the show and the fandom tend to read very differently, depending on which frame they apply to her. Through one lens, she is a woman trapped in a marriage she entered too young, with a man she has outgrown, held in place by the dual weight of her children's needs and her own fear of what freedom would reveal about who she actually is without the structure of domestic life to organize herself around. Through another lens, she is a person who consistently treats her husband with a contempt that exceeds what his actual failings warrant, who participates in the dynamic Rick has established around Jerry rather than resisting it, and who uses her intelligence to justify behavior toward the person she married that the show presents as harmful, without always being willing to hold her accountable for the harm outright. The show keeps both lenses available and does not adjudicate between them with any consistency, which is either a sophisticated commitment to moral complexity or a failure of nerve about a judgment the character's behavior would otherwise require. And the fandom has been divided on which of those it is for as long as the debate has been running. The clone storyline in the 4th season is where Beth's fan reception became genuinely fractured in ways it has not recovered from. Rick offers her a clone of herself so that one version can stay in the domestic life and one can leave for adventure, then erases his own knowledge of which Beth is the original so that neither he nor either Beth will ever know the answer. The show presents this as a gesture of liberation, Rick giving his daughter the freedom to be everything at once without having to choose, and Beth receives it in roughly those terms. What the fandom receives it as depends heavily on prior disposition. Fans who have been reading Beth sympathetically see a woman finally given the freedom her father's abandonment cost her. The ability to pursue both of the lives she wanted without the cruelty of being forced to discard one. Fans reading her more critically see a woman accepting an arrangement that absolves her of accountability for either choice, enabled by the same father whose pattern of solving problems in ways that avoid consequence has been running through the show since the pilot. The clone arc is the clearest moment where the show's ambiguity about Beth stops feeling like complexity and starts feeling like a decision not to decide. And that sensation of suspended judgment is what the critical portion of the fandom has found hardest to forgive across the seasons that followed it. Space Beth, the version who went to the stars, became a recurring character in later seasons and brought new divisions with her. Her dynamic with domestic Beth is one of the more intriguing things the show has attempted with the character in recent years, staging a confrontation between two versions of the same woman who have made opposite choices and must now reckon with what those choices have produced in each of them, and what, if anything, remains constant across the difference. Supporters found it a genuinely interesting exploration of identity and the relationship between the decisions a person makes and the self that persists beneath them. Critics found it a storyline that prioritized the conceptual novelty of the premise over the more pressing questions about accountability and consequence that the clone arc had raised and never answered. Both responses are honest engagements with material the show put there deliberately, and neither can be dismissed as a misreading of intentions the writing made clear. The therapy episode remains the single most revealing piece of evidence about how the show understands Beth at a structural level. Dr. Wong's assessment lands on the whole family, but what it reveals about Beth specifically is that she has adopted Rick's habit of using intelligence as a defense against feeling with enough thoroughness that she can walk out of a therapy session, immediately begin dismantling its conclusions in conversation with her father, and feel entirely at ease doing so. They leave together and plan to go drinking. Morty and Summer quietly express that they would like to keep going. The generational transmission of the avoidance pattern is presented in that single scene with more economy than most of the season's larger storylines manage. And what it shows about Beth is that the damage does not stop with her. She has absorbed it and is passing it forward. And she is doing so without the grief that makes Rick's version of the same avoidance legible as a response to something unbearable. Rick avoids feeling because a specific loss made feeling intolerable. Beth avoids feeling because she was raised by someone who modeled avoidance as the intelligent response. And the distinction matters because one is a wound and the other is a learned behavior. And learned behaviors are things a person can be held more accountable for continuing than wounds can be held accountable for existing. The question the show has never fully answered about Beth is whether it holds her responsible for the lesson or only for the fact of her father. The difference between those two positions is the difference between a character arc that moves toward accountability and one that moves toward explanation. And Rick and Morty has consistently stopped short of the first in her case, while committing to it fully in others. Rick is held accountable within his own portrait, even as the show extends enormous sympathy for the grief that shaped him. Jerry is held accountable for his failures, even as the show quietly suggests the environment producing them is not entirely of his making. Beth sits uneasily between those two treatments, extended more sympathy than her behavior consistently warrants, and held to less accountability than her impact on the people around her would seem to require. And the fandom has registered that imbalance without always being able to name it precisely. The show seems to find something in her harder to judge than it finds in her father, possibly because she is genuinely more sympathetic as a person formed by damage rather than one who formed the damage herself. Or possibly because committing to a full verdict on Beth would require the show to be harder on Rick than it has been willing to be, since the line between her worst qualities and his runs straighter than either portrait fully acknowledges. She is not hated with the focused passion the fandom directs at Jerry, and she is not loved with the devotion it gives to Rick or Evil Morty or Bird Person. She occupies a more uncomfortable middle space, the space of a character the audience can see clearly enough to feel conflicted about, whose best and worst qualities are both visible and both real, and whose relationship with the people around her cannot be reduced to a simple verdict without losing something important about what makes her worth watching in the first place. The fandom is not sure what to do with her, and the show, across 8 seasons of variable attention and suspended judgment, has not always been sure either. And that shared uncertainty is the most honest thing the two of them have managed together across a decade of returning to a person the show built to be genuinely difficult to understand and has not yet found the courage to fully see. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Beth sits at the difficult center between the show's moral poles, too complicated for a clean verdict and too inconsistently handled for a settled one. Next, the focus moves to the family's other daughter figure, a character who began as a background presence and became one of the most passionately argued over members of the cast, for reasons that have everything to do with the direction she chose to grow. Section 8. Summer Smith. The character the fandom watched become someone else. Summer Smith began the series as the easiest character to overlook. She was the older sibling in the background, a teenager worried about her social standing while her brother went on interdimensional adventures, present in the household but rarely at the center of the story. The early seasons gave her occasional spotlight moments and then returned her to the margins, and the fandom treated her accordingly, noticing her when she was funny or sharp and directing its attention elsewhere the rest of the time. Then the show began doing something it had not announced and did not explain, which was to let her change, slowly and in the direction of the person she was spending the most time around. And the fandom noticed the change and divided sharply over what it meant. The division is not the usual kind. Most character disagreements in Rick and Morty fandom are debates about whether someone is good or bad, sympathetic or culpable, well-written or wasted. The debate about Summer is different. It is a debate about whether the direction she has moved is something the show presents as growth or as damage. And the show's own framing on that question has been inconsistent enough that the fandom has been forced to make the call for itself. Some fans have made it one way and some another, and the people on each side find the other side's reading almost incomprehensible, which is the clearest sign that the show has left something genuinely unresolved at the center of a character it keeps returning to without fully committing to. The early Summer is a character whose intelligence the show presents as a quiet contrast to the more dramatic intelligence around her. She reads people. She understands the social dynamics of whatever room she is in with a speed and accuracy that neither Rick nor Morty consistently demonstrates in human contexts. Rick builds devices to solve people problems. Summer tends to see the people problem directly and move toward it without the intermediate step of engineering a solution. In the first season episode, Something Ricked This Way Comes, she takes a job at a shop run by a devil figure and treats the employer with a skepticism and perceptiveness that the show frames as its own kind of intelligence, different from Rick's and not lesser for the difference. The post-credits scene, where she and Rick bulk up and beat up a range of genuinely terrible people together, is one of the first moments the show allows the audience to see that the relationship between Rick and Summer could be something other than dismissal and endurance. He sees something in her. She sees something in him. The seed gets planted, and then several seasons pass before the show decides what to do with it. What it eventually does is let her become more like him, and the question the fandom has been arguing about ever since is whether that development is a tragedy or a triumph. The evidence for tragedy is substantial and builds steadily across the middle seasons. Summer's adoption of Rick's habits includes his contempt for vulnerability, his willingness to deploy cruelty as a form of efficiency, his tendency to treat other people's feelings as obstacles to be navigated rather than realities to be respected. By the later seasons, she can trade genuinely cutting observations with Rick without flinching, survives situations that would have been catastrophic for her early season self, and has developed an emotional toughness that reads as competence in the context of interdimensional crisis, and reads as hardening in the context of the family dinner table. She has become someone Rick takes seriously, and the cost of becoming that person is visible in how she treats the people who are not Rick, which is increasingly with a version of the same casual dismissiveness she once received from him. The evidence for triumph is equally real, and the fandom that holds it does so with genuine conviction. Summer's development from background teenager to someone who can stand beside Rick in a genuine crisis and contribute meaningfully is earned across seasons of experience that would have broken a less resilient person entirely. The warrior version of Summer that emerges in the third season's post-apocalyptic dimension storyline is one of the images the fandom returns to most consistently as evidence for what she is capable of when the ordinary constraints of her life fall away, and she is simply required to be equal to what is in front of her. She is formidable in those moments. She is resourceful and fast and genuinely dangerous in ways that surprise even Rick. And the show treats her competence in those sequences with the same respect it extends to Rick himself, which is the highest available currency in the show's particular economy of value. The fandom that loves later Summer tends to experience her development as the story of a person discovering she is genuinely capable rather than merely told she is, and finding that the discovery requires her to become harder than she was before she knew it. That reading is not wrong. It is a response to real things the writing has done. The problem is that the writing has also done the other things, the moments that show the cost of the hardening in how it lands on the people nearest her. And the show has not consistently held those two things in the same frame long enough to force the audience to feel the connection between them. An episode that gives Summer a moment of genuine power is frequently followed by one that shows the collateral damage of the version she has become. And the show's habit of staging these as separate stories rather than as one continuous portrait is the source of most of the fandom's inability to agree on what she is. Her relationship with Rick is the axis around which all of it turns. The show has been careful to give it a texture that distinguishes it from Rick's relationship with Morty, which is built on years of sustained manipulation and a specific history of exploitation the series documents with accumulating honesty. Rick and Summer operate differently. He dismisses her less readily than he dismisses most people. She calls him out more readily than most people do. There is a quality of mutual recognition in their dynamic that is absent from the Rick and Jerry relationship, and somewhat different from the Rick and Morty relationship, because Morty's connection to Rick is filtered through love and need in ways that keep him perpetually susceptible to being steered, while Summer's connection to it runs through a sharper and less forgiving awareness of what Rick is actually doing when he does what he does. She sees more of the strings. The show has been honest about that difference since the beginning, and it is the source of what makes the Rick and Summer dynamic feel more like a negotiation between near equals than anything else in the show's family relationships. The sixth season episode, Rick, A Mort Well Lived, gave the fandom the most sustained demonstration of what Summer is when the choice she makes matters most. Tasked with keeping Morty's body alive and functional while Rick is inside a video game trying to retrieve Morty's consciousness, she improvises her way through a deteriorating situation with a combination of practical resourcefulness and genuine desperation that the show stages as unambiguously heroic. She is not doing it to impress Rick. She is not doing it because it is interesting. She is doing it because it is Morty, and Morty is her brother, and the stakes are as real as stakes get for her. The fandom responded to that episode as one of the most emotionally satisfying things the later seasons had produced. For Summer, specifically, because it showed the version of her that still chooses the people she loves over everything else the show has been teaching her to prioritize. And it showed that version operating at full capacity, rather than as a remnant of who she used to be. The criticism that accumulates around Summer in later seasons tends to coalesce most visibly around her treatment of Jerry, which the fandom has raised with a consistency that suggests the issue is doing more work than any individual scene accounts for. Her contempt for her own father, which mirrors Rick's in texture and casualness, is one of the clearest demonstrations that the damage the show traces through Rick does not stop with the person Rick directly touches. Beth absorbed it and passed it forward. Summer, the child who has moved most deliberately into Rick's orbit and most completely adopted his way of seeing, has absorbed it most thoroughly, and the ease with which she directs it at Jerry carries a cruelty that exceeds what his actual failings warrant. The show does not consistently hold her accountable for that excess, and the fandom that notices it finds the inconsistency harder to forgive as the seasons accumulate. The show's treatment of Summer's relationship with her own gender and social identity across the seasons is a thread the fandom has engaged with less frequently, but that carries real weight in the portrait. Early Summer is acutely aware of the social dynamics of being a teenage girl in a world that has very specific ideas about what that means. And the intelligence she applies to navigating those dynamics is presented as a form of competence the show finds genuinely interesting. As she moves closer to Rick's orbit and further from the ordinary social world of her high school, the show gradually stops giving her material that engages with that dimension of her experience, as if the process of becoming someone Rick respects requires leaving behind the parts of herself that were most specifically her own. The fandom that loved the early Summer's social perceptiveness sometimes finds the later Summer's increasing resemblance to a Rick-adjacent action figure to be a trade the show made without fully accounting for what was lost in it. Her arc across the complete run of the series is the test case for one of the show's most important and least answered questions, which is whether becoming capable by Rick's standards and becoming a better person are the same thing or different things, and whether the show is willing to engage with the possibility that they might be in tension. Rick and Morty has built its most sustained critique around the argument that Rick's intelligence and Rick's isolation are the same fact seen from two angles, that the brilliance and the damage are not separable qualities, but expressions of a single orientation toward the world. If that argument is true of Rick, and the show has spent 8 seasons demonstrating that it is, then the question Summer raises is whether the same orientation produces the same results in a different person at a different scale. The fandom has been asking that question without quite naming it for years, and the show has been providing partial answers without committing to the full one. What gives the debate around Summer its particular energy is that neither side is working from a misreading. The fans who love her later seasons are responding to real competence and real loyalty that the writing has genuinely built. The fans who find her trajectory troubling are responding to real costs and real callousness that the writing has also genuinely built. The show put both things there and has been letting them coexist without forcing them into direct confrontation. And the fandom has experienced that coexistence as an ongoing argument rather than a resolved portrait. That argument is the most honest measure of how seriously the show has taken her, because characters who do not matter do not generate this kind of sustained interpretive disagreement. The fandom argues about Summer with this intensity because the show has given it enough real material to argue about, which is its own form of respect for what the character is capable of carrying. The relationship with Morty remains the most reliable thread of warmth running through even the most critical readings of her later seasons. They have been through the same things and responded in different directions, and the sibling recognition between people who share a history but not a solution is one of the things the show stages between them with more tenderness than it usually permits itself. When Summer chooses Morty, clearly and at cost, the fandom that has found her recent development frustrating tends to feel the choice as a reminder of what is still there underneath everything she has become. She has not been replaced by someone harder. She has become someone harder, who still contains the person who was there before. And the moments when that containment becomes visible are the moments the show earns the most complicated version of the audience's affection for her. Summer Smith works across 8 seasons of variable attention and unresolved tension as the character who makes the show's own commitments most visible by testing them in a different register. The argument about her is the argument about Rick, scaled down and shifted into a frame where the mitigation of grief and genius is less available, where the behavior has to stand more fully on its own, without the extraordinary context that surrounds everything Rick does. She is the show asking, in a quieter key, whether the habits it has spent 8 seasons treating as the signature of its most complex and beloved character are actually habits worth celebrating, or habits worth watching with the specific vigilance that love for someone requires when the thing you love about them is also the thing that worries you most. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Summer's arc turned the show's deepest question about Rick's way of being into a test that plays out at a smaller scale and without the same available mitigation, leaving the fandom to argue about what it sees in the result. Next, the focus shifts to the characters who earned their negative reception through specific acts the show presented without ambiguity. The figures the fandom hated not as a mirror, but as a verdict. Section 9. The characters the fandom hated without apology. Not every negative fan reaction requires unpacking. Some characters in Rick and Morty drew their bad reception through some acts the show presented without ambiguity. Moments where the writing did not leave room for the interpretive generosity that complicates the feelings around Jerry or Beth or Summer. These are the characters the fandom hated not because of what they reflected back at the audience or because of a trajectory that raised uncomfortable questions, but because of what they did on screen, clearly and without mitigation. The verdict on them is not a mirror and not a debate. It is a response to something the show staged and expected the audience to find unforgivable. And the audience obliged with a consistency that has not softened across any number of rewatches or years of distance. Mr. Jellybean arrived in the first season episode Me Seeks and Destroy, during the adventure half of a dual storyline, a fantasy world parody that opened with the gentle, familiar rhythms of a role-playing game setup. Rick and Morty enter a tavern. Morty, who has insisted on leading an adventure for once, is shaken by an early encounter. Mr. Jellybean appears in a bathroom as a kindly older figure, apparently there to offer comfort to a distressed child. The scene turns in a direction the show does not spell out in visual detail, but communicates with absolute clarity through what it shows and what it withholds. Mr. Jellybean attempts to assault Morty. The scene cuts away. The adventure continues. The show does not address what happened for the remainder of the episode's runtime. What it does instead is something more considered than a direct confrontation would have been. The fantasy world's inhabitants, gathered at the conclusion of the adventure to celebrate the heroes, reveal that Mr. Jellybean is their beloved king, the figure of public reverence and communal pride around whom their entire society's sense of itself is organized. The gap between his public face and what he did in private is not presented as a twist to be gasped at. It is presented as a fact the audience is now required to hold. Then the episode's final image. Rick, who witnessed what happened in that bathroom and said nothing to Morty during the hours that followed, quietly destroying a photograph of the king before his grandson can see it. The act is small and wordless and entirely uncharacteristic of the Rick the show usually presents, and it lands as one of the cleanest demonstrations of genuine care the first season produced. He cannot fix what happened. He can remove one specific reminder of it, and he does, alone, without making it about himself. The fandom's hatred of Mr. Jellybean was never complicated by ambivalence and has never become so. The show did not offer an explanation for him, or a backstory that recontextualized the act, or a moment of reckoning that provided catharsis. He did what he did, his public life continued as though he had done nothing, and the only justice in the episode is private and imperfect, a photograph destroyed by a man who was not there in time to prevent the harm. The Reddit commenter whose phrasing the fandom has quoted most persistently described his act as everyday evil. And that phrase has stuck because it captures exactly what the show was staging. Not a theatrical villain constructing elaborate schemes from a position of declared hostility. A figure of ordinary authority doing something monstrous in private, protected by the same social elevation that made him appear trustworthy in the first place. The fandom's clean and lasting hatred for him is a response to that specific combination. Cruelty plus impunity plus the structural protection of respectability. And the show earned every bit of it. Tammy Gutterman built her negative reception through a different mechanism, one that required more time and more investment from the audience before the betrayal could land with the force it needed. She is introduced in the first season as Summer's friend, a recurring background presence at high school parties who generates no particular feeling in either direction. She is there. She is friendly. She occupies the margins of the show's domestic world without demanding attention. The show then does something that feels, in retrospect, like a long and patient setup. It gives her a genuine relationship. Bird Person, who has been established as Rick's oldest friend and one of the show's most quietly beloved figures, meets Tammy at a party in the first season finale. By the second season finale, the Wedding Squanchers, they are getting married. The wedding episode is one of the most tonally distinctive things the show produced in its early seasons, because it commits to a register of genuine celebration before it commits to what the celebration is concealing. The location is beautiful. The guests are characters the show has built warmth around. There is a real sense of an occasion being honored rather than merely staged, and the audience is allowed to settle into that feeling before the episode removes it. Tammy is a deep cover agent for the Galactic Federation. She shoots Bird Person at the reception. The Galactic Federation descends on the celebration. Everything that felt like a genuine moment of joy in the show's universe turns out to have been a trap, and the person at the center of the trap is someone the audience had placed, without quite realizing it, in the category of the trusted. The specific quality of the betrayal is what makes the fandom's response to it so durable. Tammy did not fail in her cover because she was careless or because something unexpected broke her concentration. She maintained it completely, across an entire season of apparent sincerity, through a relationship that the show presented with enough emotional weight to make Bird Person's investment in it feel real rather than convenient. The fandom's negative feeling toward her was never primarily about her as a character in her own right, because the show gave her very little interior life to engage with. It was always about what she cost, and that cost, measured across the seasons that followed in Bird Person's absence and then in his degradation as Phoenix Person, was too specific and too sustained to be absorbed as simply part of the show's general willingness to be cruel. Phoenix Person deepened the fandom's negative feeling in a way that simple death could not have. Bird Person was not killed and mourned. He was killed and converted. His body rebuilt into a weapon controlled by the institution that murdered him. His loyalty to Rick twisted into its opposite. Every quality that had made him someone worth caring about stripped away and replaced with a function. He was used. And Tammy was the instrument of that use, present through the Phoenix Person arc as the figure who wielded what had been made of him. The fandom's anger at her was not the clean anger that follows a surprising betrayal. It was the slow and accumulating anger that follows watching someone you loved be degraded over time by a person who understood exactly what they were destroying and destroyed it anyway. His eventual restoration in the sixth season, achieved through Rick entering his ruined mind and staying there until something worth saving could be recovered, closed a chapter the fandom had been holding open since the wedding. The relief of that closure was real and significant, but it did not rehabilitate Tammy. Her death, when it came, produced a response from the fandom that was less triumphant than settling. The quiet acknowledgement that an account had finally been balanced, rather than the satisfaction of a victory. The hatred the fandom directed at her was never going to be satisfied by anything the show could provide, because what she took was not something the show's mechanics could fully return. Rick Prime sits in a category of his own, separated from other hated characters by the specific nature of what he did and the specific way the show chose to reveal it. He murdered Diane. Not in the heat of conflict, or as collateral damage in a larger plan, or as the result of a miscalculation that got away from him. He used a weapon called the Omega device to erase her from every reality simultaneously, making the loss total and unreachable by any of the mechanisms Rick usually deploys against irreversibility. He did this not because Diane had done something to him, or because she represented a threat he needed to eliminate. He did it because another version of himself had declined his offer of a life of interdimensional adventure. And the woman that other version loved was, in his assessment, a reason to decline. He removed her as though she were an argument he had won, rather than a person he had ended. The fandom's response to that act, when the full shape of it was revealed across the 5th and 6th seasons, was the cleanest negative reception the show has produced for any character. There was no segment of the fandom that found mitigation for it, or a reading that complicated the verdict. The Omega device's specific property, erasing a person from every possible reality rather than ending a single instance of a life, is the show's way of making the act as total as the loss it produced in Rick C-137. There is no alternate Diane who survived. There is no parallel timeline where she is still alive. Rick Prime looked at the entirety of a person's existence across all of creation and decided to empty it. And he did so without apparent difficulty or subsequent reflection. The hatred the fandom directed at him was the simplest and most proportionate response the show has ever asked for. His competence as an antagonist extended and maintained that hatred across the seasons before his defeat, in a way that simple villainy rarely manages. Rick Prime staying ahead of the greatest manhunt the show's universe has ever produced was not presented as a plot convenience or a dramatic necessity the show acknowledged with a wink. It was presented as a fact about who he is relative to who Rick C-137 is. A demonstration that inside the specific game Rick has organized his entire life around, there exists a version of himself who plays it better. The fandom hated him most effectively in those seasons, not because of what he was doing in any given episode, but because of what his continued freedom implied about the limits of the intelligence the show had spent years establishing as without equal. He made the hunt feel real by making the failure to conclude it feel real. And the audience's investment in his defeat was sustained across seasons by the consistent demonstration that the defeat was genuinely not guaranteed. Unmortrican's conclusion of the hunt produced one of the more complicated collective reactions in the show's recent history. The fandom wanted Rick Prime dead, and then found, in many cases, that having it was less satisfying than wanting it had been, which is exactly what the show was aiming for. The emptiness Rick feels standing over the body is not a failure of dramatic construction. It is the show being honest about what the hunt was actually for, which was never really Rick Prime's death. It was Diane's life, and no outcome the hunt could produce was ever going to return that. Rick Prime's death settled a specific account and left the original wound completely untouched. And the fandom's muted response to what should have been a triumphant conclusion reflects how thoroughly the writing had made that gap legible in advance. The Galactic Federation as an institution occupied a different position in the fandom's negative reception because the negative feeling it generated was less personal and more structural. The discomfort of recognizing a familiar kind of power rather than the anger of watching a specific act. The Federation converts everything it touches into a managed and administered version of itself, turns resistance into bureaucracy, turns living beings into categories, turns the full complexity of a civilization into a compliance problem. The show's critique of it runs through every season with the consistency of a genuine argument rather than a recurring plot device. And the fandom absorbed the argument and directed genuine animosity at the institution, which is an unusual response to an organization rather than a person, but entirely consistent with how completely the show had built its world around the opposition between Rick's chaotic freedom and the Federation's comprehensive order. What connects every character and institution in this section's catalog is the thing the show treats most consistently as the worst possible use of whatever capacity a being possesses. Mr. Jellybean uses the trust that authority generates to prey on someone who extended it in good faith. Tammy uses the trust that intimacy generates to facilitate institutional violence. Rick Prime uses a superior intelligence not to build or understand or escape, but purely to eliminate, removing what he found inconvenient without a second thought about what the removal cost. The Federation uses structural power to convert everything that exceeds its definitions into a problem to be contained. Each of them represents the conversion of some form of advantage into a tool aimed directly at the people who had no reasonable choice but to be vulnerable to it. And the fandom's clean and lasting hatred for all of them is the most direct evidence the show has produced that its audience has been paying attention to what the writing was actually arguing. The characters people love in Rick and Morty are, in their various complications, figures who use whatever they have been given in ways the show treats as having some worth, even when the worth is partial and the cost is real, and the methods are frequently indefensible. The characters people hate without negotiation are the ones who have converted their capacity purely into a mechanism for taking from others, without the grief or the love or the struggle towards something better that the show extends as at least partial mitigation to almost everyone else in the cast. The line between those categories is not about morality in a simple sense. Rick has done things that would place him in the second category on a purely consequentialist accounting. The line is about whether a character is trying in some direction towards something the show can read as human, or whether they have stopped trying entirely and settled for extraction. The fandom reads that line with a consistency that suggests the show drew it clearly enough to be understood, even when it never stated it outright. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next, the focus pulls back from individual characters to ask the larger question the whole divide has been building toward: what the fandom's loves and hatreds reveal about the show itself and the audience it built across a decade of stories that refused to make any of this simple. Section 10. What the fandom's choices reveal. The loves and the hatreds the show produced are not random. They follow a logic, and once that logic becomes visible, it says something about both the show and the people watching it that neither party fully intended to put on display. The map of who gets adored and who gets despised is, in the end, a portrait of what a decade of storytelling taught its audience to value. And the teaching ran deeper than anyone sitting down to watch an animated comedy about a drunk scientist and his grandson probably expected it to. The most revealing thing about how the Rick and Morty fandom distributes its love and hatred is not any individual verdict. It is the pattern underneath all of them, which is that the audience tends to love the characters it can watch from a distance and hate the ones it cannot. Rick is thrilling to watch because the audience occupies a position no character in the show ever gets to occupy, which is close enough to his intelligence to feel the pleasure of it, and far enough from his behavior to avoid the cost. The family absorbs the cost. The audience absorbs the entertainment. That asymmetry is not accidental. It is the specific architecture the show built to make Rick lovable to the very people he would, in real life, be most difficult to know. The fandom rarely talks about this directly, but it shows up clearly in how the community discusses the characters it loves most. The language fans use around Rick tends to be the language of appreciation rather than intimacy, the vocabulary of someone describing a spectacle they witnessed rather than a relationship they survive. Words like genius and ruthless and efficient appear constantly. Words like warm or safe or present appear almost never, which is accurate because Rick is almost never those things. The fandom loves him for what he is capable of, rather than for how it would feel to be near him, and the distinction is everything. Capability, watched from a comfortable seat, is exhilarating. Capability experienced from the inside of a family it regularly damages is something considerably harder to describe with excitement. Evil Morty drew his enormous fandom through an even cleaner version of that same dynamic. He offered the show's most complete demonstration of a plan executed across years with total precision, and the audience got to watch every stage of it from the outside, never inside the damage, never carrying the weight of what the plan required. The Mortys who died building his weapon are mentioned, The Citadel's population, which included many beings who did not choose to be part of the system he destroyed, is a number the episode references and moves past. The fandom moved past it too, with a speed that tells you something about how thoroughly the show had positioned the audience to root for the outcome rather than reckon with the process. Evil Morty gave the fandom what it wanted, a mind that could not be stopped achieving a goal the audience found philosophically satisfying, and the audience took it without much negotiation about the terms. Jerry generated the opposite response for reasons that are almost perfectly symmetrical. He cannot be watched from a comfortable distance because he keeps doing the thing that makes comfortable distance impossible, which is being recognizable. The specific texture of Jerry's failures is not the texture of a villain or an alien or a cosmic threat. It is the texture of a person sitting across a dinner table, wanting approval from people who have decided not to give it. Pressing forward anyway in ways that make the wanting visible when invisibility would serve him better. That visibility is the source of the discomfort the fandom converts into contempt. A person who makes their need legible in a room that has been trained to find need embarrassing is going to absorb the embarrassment rather than the sympathy. And the Rick and Morty fandom is, by the show's own design, a room that has been extensively trained to find need embarrassing. What makes this more than a simple observation about audience psychology is that the show built it deliberately and then built the critique of it into the same structure. The Amortican Grick Fiddy episode, where aliens who feed on suffering become devoted Jerry fans, is the show holding a mirror up to its own fandom with a directness it usually reserves for its most self-aware moments. The aliens call Jerry's failures delicious. They praise his lack of self-awareness. They gather around him the way a crowd gathers around any spectacle of human dignity failing to hold itself together under pressure. The audience watching the episode is laughing at Jerry alongside the aliens, and the episode knows it, and the episode is making a specific point about what that laughter means. The fandom largely laughed and moved on, which is itself the most accurate possible demonstration of the point. The beloved side characters sit in the fan reception map at the exact coordinates where uncomplicated feeling is possible. And the consistency of that positioning tells you something about what the fandom was looking for underneath all the complexity the show was providing. Mr. Meeseeks exists for one thing, is entirely committed to that one thing, and the clarity of his purpose is the source of both his comedy and his pathos. Mr. Poopy Butthole is decent in a show that treats decency as a quality requiring explanation. And the fandom's warmth toward him has always contained a quality of relief. The specific relief of encountering something the show did not immediately complicate. Bird Person is loyal in a universe where loyalty is consistently tested and often punished. And the fandom held on to that loyalty across years of watching it be tested at the highest possible stakes. These are not the most complex characters the show produced. They are the most restful ones, and the consistency with which the fandom returned to them suggests that the show's commitment to complexity, however much the audience claimed to love it, carried a cost in sustained emotional labor that the simpler loves provided relief from. The clean hatreds are worth examining from this angle too, because what Mr. Jellybean and Tammy and Rick Prime have in common is not simply that they did bad things. Plenty of characters in Rick and Morty do bad things without generating anything close to the sustained and uncomplicated negative feeling those three produced. What they did was damage something the show had made the audience care about, in ways that the show presented without the usual apparatus of mitigation and complexity. Mr. Jellybean harmed a child the audience had been following for a full season. Tammy destroyed a friendship the show had treated as one of its most sacred things. Rick Prime erased the person whose loss organized the entire portrait of the character the fandom loved most. The hatred directed at them is not a moral response to their actions in the abstract. It is a protective response to what their actions cost something the audience had already invested in. And the investment is the key. The characters who draw clean hatred are the ones who damaged something the fandom could not afford to lose. This is where the love and hate map becomes most revealing about what Rick and Morty actually built across a decade. Because what the map shows is a fandom that invested deeply and specifically, and in ways that tracked exactly where the show directed it. The audience loved what the writing told it to love, hated what the writing positioned it to hate, and divided exactly where the writing left things unresolved. That level of responsiveness to a show's creative choices is not the mark of a passive audience being manipulated. It is the mark of an audience that was genuinely engaged, that allowed the storytelling to do its work on them across years of watching, and that arrived at feelings that were real rather than performed, precisely because the investment was real. The fandom's character preferences also shifted across the show's run in ways that track the writing's own evolution. Early seasons produced a community organized almost entirely around Rick's spectacle and Morty's decency as its complementary anchor. The middle seasons introduced Evil Morty as a third pole that drew enormous energy and generated an entirely new category of fan investment: the long game mystery that rewarded obsessive attention in the specific way the show had been training its audience to pay obsessive attention from the beginning. The later seasons produced something more complicated: a fandom that had accumulated enough history with these characters to have genuinely mixed feelings about some of them, that found Morty harder to read simply as sympathetic, that found Summer's trajectory genuinely difficult to settle on, that found the resolution of the Rick Prime storyline unexpectedly hollow rather than triumphant. Those evolved and complicated responses are the evidence that the show had actually produced something the audience was experiencing rather than simply consuming. The most honest thing the fandom's loves and hatreds reveal about Rick and Morty is that the show succeeded at its actual ambition, which was not to produce the smartest animated comedy ever made, though it may have done that too, but to produce a story that the audience could not observe from a safe distance indefinitely. The safety kept failing. The comfortable position outside the damage kept collapsing. The characters the fandom thought it was watching as spectacle kept turning out to be portraits of something the audience recognized from closer range than it had intended to stand. Jerry turned out to be a mirror. Beth turned out to be a question the show was asking about the audience's own relationship with avoidance. Rick turned out to be a portrait of the specific kind of loneliness that intelligence at the expense of connection produces. And the audience's love for him turned out to be complicated by the growing recognition that what it had been admiring was also a warning. The fandom did not always accept the complication gracefully. It argued about it at length across thousands of forum threads and comment sections and video essays. But the arguing is itself the evidence. A show that provokes this much sustained disagreement about what it means and who deserves what is a show that has done something to its audience that the audience cannot simply file away and forget. The specific shape of the loves and hatreds, which characters sit at the top and which at the bottom, and which in the unresolved middle, is ultimately a portrait of the show's values as they were received rather than as they were intended. And the gap between those two things is where the most interesting conversation lives. The writers built a world designed to make certain kinds of intelligence look thrilling and certain kinds of ordinariness look embarrassing. And then they built, inside that same world, a sustained argument that the embarrassment was the audience's problem rather than Jerry's. They built a villain the fandom adored and a father the fandom despised, and let the distance between those two responses do the work of an argument no speech in the show ever quite delivered outright. They gave the audience a genius to love, and then spent 8 seasons asking, quietly and from every angle available to them, whether the thing the audience was loving was actually worth what it cost. The fandom answered that question differently depending on the season, the episode, and what each individual viewer brought to the screen with them. That variability is not a failure of the show's argument. It is the argument succeeding at the level of a real question rather than a rhetorical one. Rick and Morty asked something genuine about what intelligence is for, and it asked it through the specific mechanism of making the audience care deeply about a cast of characters who embodied different possible answers. And then it watched what the audience did with the caring. What the fandom did, across a decade of loving and hating and arguing and theorizing, is the most complete answer to that question the show ever received. And it is more honest than any ending the writers could have scripted. Because it was produced not by a writing room with a thesis to deliver, but by millions of people responding to something that had genuinely gotten under their skin. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.